I was fortunate enough to be born into a family of creatives. Both of my parents were very artistic and they were always building or drawing or painting. And in addition to just being in a really inspiring rural environment with animals and nature, they really sparked a lot of curiosity in me and introduced us as kids to the world and the wonder of rural life. So I think by the age of 5, when I was in kindergarten, I already knew that I wanted to be a professional artist. I was heavily influenced by my mother as I watched her in her studio painting away. She was a very accomplished artist and she had such amazing abilities in painting realism, painting animals and wildlife specifically, and she worked in watercolor. So I think that is what drew me to watercolor straight away. I saw what kind of detail she could get and how lovingly she painted every stroke, and was probably the biggest influence on me and what drew me to watercolor in the first place. So I actually grew up near the area where I'm living now. I ended up moving about an hour and a half east of Ottawa, very close to my homestead, and fell in love, and now I have this big, bright, beautiful studio in the country. Moving back to the area has metaphorically and intellectually and emotionally really changed the way that I paint. And although I've never let the subject matter go, the idea of painting rural art always kind of kept me going through life as I lived in the big city. But moving back to the countryside, it's just been a complete coming home in every sense of the word. Both kind of drawing from my childhood experiences, but just my aesthetic in general, and documenting farm life and rural life. That's just something that I think is just part of the foundation of who I am as a person, as well as being an artist. Painting rural life to me is, especially now as we see big changes in agriculture, in the scale of farming and the industrialization of it, painting that older way of life is a way of kind of hanging on to some of that preciousness, but also as a documentative means for me, it's really important to capture especially some of the older buildings and some of those older homesteads and barns in particular, those old buildings and structures. It really gives us a glimpse into the types of settlers that built it, stories that lie in those old structures, and the types of lives that were created and formed in those more primitive and pioneer days. In Farmhouse, Menagerie, I'm introducing animals into a rural setting in the sense that not only is it domesticated, but they are inside the house. And I think for me, the idea of bringing them into the home and presenting them in such a manner likely ties into my own imagination as a child. And there are often times where I would imagine some of our own farm animals as my siblings, and to me they were really just extensions of our family. And this is something that I think makes me also feel really committed to that idea of conservation and protecting animals and treating them humanely, because I've always really felt this personification of animals and my emotional and compassionate side when interacting with them. Some of that comes from my desire to capture something old and traditional and nostalgic feeling just on a purely aesthetic level, but on a deeper level, this really speaks to my influence and experience living and being in spaces like that. My grandmother had a really fun and interesting house where there were these creaky stairs that led to the upper level, and there was a very Victorian feel to the interior. And I remember old dresser drawers that were lined with wallpaper, and even in our own home. I remember my parents bringing this giant ring binder of wallpaper samples, and I just like poured over that, touching each page and letting myself get lost in some of the color and the fantasy of some of those patterns. And it's definitely a tie into just some of my direct experiences with that. And thinking back, I even had an experience to visit Beatrix Potter's home, who children's book illustration is something that has always fascinated me. And seeing her home and her garden and some of the pattern on pattern, like old china ware pieces, and I just crave that luscious pattern on pattern. Having that natural animal in front of or juxtaposed with these man-made patterns and colors and textures, I think is a fun play and creates a little bit more tension on the surface, and visually tells a little bit of a story and gives us a glimpse into where they are and the era of the story that I'm trying to tell. I think children's book illustration has played a huge part in my own editing as an artist and some of the aesthetic choices that I make. Reading children's books as a kid, it was a way for me to get lost in these fantasy worlds, and it also imprinted on me this idea of playing with animals, poring over these pages and flipping through these pages where the characters were all human in story, but they were in fact badgers and toads and rabbits. This was an opportunity for me to really enter into that space and interact. And I think this also really helped to cultivate the compassion that I feel, knowing that animals do have emotions just as we do as people. And it was a bonus, of course, to actually grow up around animals. Because I started in watercolor, I think that that has in many ways carried over into how I approach my oil painting. And I'm self-taught, so I've sort of fumbled through and worked out my own process that kind of speaks to how I like to play with color. And watercolor, because of its natural tendency towards transparency and translucency, it comes into play in these thin applications of color that I use on the canvas when I'm working in oil. And in particular, I'm finding that working on wood panel also allows me, because of a firmer surface, allows me to apply a layer, sand it down, apply another layer, just working in those thin veils and that transparency to really build up to the finished product. And I'm hoping that as a result, we're able to not think of the surface as being too tactile. My paint application is much thinner, so there's a slightly more photographic feel in some of the areas. I do sometimes play with a little bit of the thickness of the paint, but for the most part, there is a very, I think, kindred syncopation with watercolor and the way that I approach oil. Because I started as a realist painter, I'm always torn between wanting to show my skills and the breadth of my work in the pieces, and I don't think that's something that I will completely let go of, but I do like having a bit of a dialogue between looser, more expressive areas of the painting, and then drawing our focus to slightly more heightened or realistic areas. So certainly where the animals are concerned in this particular series, my hope is that they feel a little bit more three-dimensional and that they might walk off the surface of the artwork. And then I can loosen up in the brushstrokes of the background, in the wallpaper patterns, or even in the floor or the surface that they're on. I've also incorporated some gold leaf and copper leafing as well. So again, just playing a little bit push and pull with realism and then slightly more abstract shapes. That looser style, I think, comes from some of my earlier influences. I'm heavily influenced by the work of John Singer Sargent, both in his watercolors and in his oils as well, and really love that fine line that he's able to straddle between being very loose and painterly, but at the same time having an incredible sense of light and form and volume, and it feels very representational, but there's a playfulness there that I think is really attractive to me. I'm also influenced by again, children's book illustrators and people who would have been deemed as illustrators at the time, like Dutch artist Carl Larsson, even some of the Wyeth family, N.C. Wyeth, Winslow Homer as well. Some of the realist painters whose brushstrokes have a lot of life in them. That's something that I can aspire to, hopefully, and through my own process, really hone in on finding that perfect balance between realism and expressionism.